My stepdaughter said she wished my twins were never born and called them Spawn. So I cut off her tuition payments completely. I married Rick when his daughter Haley was 12, and for 4 years we were like a real family. I never tried to replace her mom, who lived across the country, with her new husband. Haley stayed with us during school and spent summers with her mom. We had this great routine where I'd help with homework, we'd bake together on Sundays, and she'd tell me about her crushes while I braided her hair. She called me by my first name, which was fine, but she'd introduce me as her bonus mom to friends, which always made me tear up. When I got pregnant with the twins, Haley was 16 and seemed excited. She helped paint the nursery, came to ultrasounds, even threw me a surprise baby shower with her friends. After the boys were born, she'd rush home from school to hold them, learn to change diapers, called herself the best big sister ever. Rick was over the moon seeing everyone together. Then Haley turned 18 and got into her dream college 3 hours away. We were so proud. Rick and I agreed to cover tuition and housing while her mom would handle books and spending money. Expensive, but worth it for Haley's future. She came home every few weeks that first semester and things seemed normal. The twins were walking by then and would scream with joy when they saw her. Second semester, something shifted. Haley started criticizing everything I did. The twins' clothes were tacky. Their toys were too loud. The food I made wasn't organic enough. She complained we'd turned her room into a playroom even though we'd only added a toy box while keeping all her stuff. Rick said she was just adjusting to college life. Spring break, she brought her roommate Amber home. Amber was one of those girls who thought having younger siblings was embarrassing, and parents were just ATMS. She kept making comments about how Haley was stuck visiting family instead of going to Cancun like everyone else. Haley started agreeing, saying the twins made it impossible to relax at home. One afternoon, I asked Haley to watch the boys for an hour while I got groceries. Came back to find them crying in their cribs and Haley on the couch with Amber watching Netflix. She said they wouldn't stop making noise, so she put them in timeout. They were 2 years old. Rick talked to her that night about responsibility, but she just rolled her eyes and said we were being dramatic about babies who wouldn't even remember. Summer came and Haley announced she was staying at school for an internship. There was no internship. Her friend posted photos of them at the beach every day. But we kept paying tuition because Rick didn't want to start drama. When she came home for Rick's birthday, the twins ran to hug her and she actually pushed them away, saying they were sticky. Then during dinner, Rick mentioned we were considering moving to a bigger house since the boys were getting bigger. Haley lost it, said we were erasing her childhood home, that everything was about the twins now, that nobody cared about her anymore. I tried explaining we'd make sure she had a room in any house we bought. That's when she said it, looked me straight in the eye and said she wished the twins were never born because they ruined everything and turned her dad into someone who only cared about his new family. Rick's face went white. The twins were right there. The older one asked why Sissy was mad. I took the boys upstairs while Rick tried to talk to Haley. I could hear her screaming about how I'd replaced her and the twins were the proof. How her life was better before I showed up with my spawn. That word, spawn, about my babies. Rick came up an hour later looking defeated. Said Haley was going back to school early and maybe everyone needed space. I agreed but knew something had to change. That night I went through our finances. We were paying $32,000 a year for Haley's education. Money that could go to the twins' college funds. Money we were struggling to afford with 2 babies. I made a decision, called the college financial aid office and said we needed to update our payment information for next semester. Removed our card and put Haley's mom's contact instead. Then I called her mom, Julia, and explained we could no longer afford tuition with the twins' expenses. Julia freaked, saying she couldn't cover it alone. I suggested Haley could take out loans like most students or transfer somewhere cheaper. 2 weeks later, Haley called Rick screaming that her registration was blocked for non-payment. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Rick moved through the house like a ghost for 3 days. He'd get coffee in the morning without looking at me, eat dinner with the twins while staring at his plate, then disappear into his home office until midnight. The boys kept asking why Daddy was quiet and I didn't have good answers. I tried talking to him twice, but he just nodded and walked away. On the 4th morning, I found him in the kitchen before the boys woke up. I asked if we could actually discuss this instead of pretending I didn't exist. He put down his coffee mug hard enough that it cracked against the counter. He said I should have talked to him before making such a huge decision about his daughter. I felt my face get hot and told him he should have defended me and the boys when his daughter called them spawn. He said that wasn't the point, and I was changing the subject. I said it was exactly the point because he let her trash our children without consequences, and now he was mad at me for doing something about it. He grabbed his keys and left for work without saying goodbye to the twins. Nova asked me at breakfast why Daddy didn't hug him, and I had to lie and say Daddy was just busy. The next afternoon, my phone rang with Julia's number. I let it go to voicemail, but then Rick's phone started ringing. He was upstairs changing Ember's diaper, so I heard the whole conversation through the baby monitor. Julia was screaming so loud I could make out every word. She said she was taking him to court for abandoning his financial obligations to his daughter. She said they'd made promises, and now he was breaking them to prioritize his new family. Rick sounded exhausted, trying to explain they never signed anything legally binding. Julia yelled that didn't matter because he'd verbally committed and she had witnesses. She said he was choosing his spawn over his first daughter, and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of father he really was. Rick said he needed time to figure things out, and Julia hung up on him. I stood in the kitchen feeling weird because part of me was glad Julia was showing her crazy side, but another part felt terrible that I'd put Rick in this spot. He came downstairs 10 minutes later and we didn't talk about the call even though we both knew I'd heard it. My mom called 2 days later. I was surprised because we usually only talk on Sundays. She said Rick's mother had mentioned the situation and she wanted to hear my side. I explained everything, starting with the spawn comment and ending with cutting off tuition. I expected support, but instead she got quiet. Then she said I had every right to be hurt, but cutting off tuition without warning was cruel. She said I was acting like Haley was evil when she was really just a confused teenager watching her family change. I tried to explain about the money and how we couldn't afford it, but Mom cut me off. She said that wasn't the real issue and I knew it. She said I'd made a huge decision out of anger instead of thinking it through. I felt my throat get tight and told her she didn't understand what it was like to hear someone call your baby's spawn. She said she did understand, but that didn't make my reaction right. I hung up feeling attacked from every direction. Even my own mother thought I was the bad guy. I sat on the couch and wondered if everyone saw me as the evil stepmother who ruined everything. That night after the boys went to bed, I pulled out our bank statements. I hadn't looked at our actual finances in months because Rick handled most of the bills. Our savings account had $3,000 when it used to have $20,000. We'd put groceries on credit cards 4 times in the past 2 months. The twins' daycare cost went up to $1,800 a month starting in January. I added up the tuition payments and realized we'd been paying almost $3,000 every month to Haley's school. No wonder we were broke. I felt justified seeing the numbers laid out like that. We literally couldn't afford to keep paying and raise 2 toddlers. But then I thought about what would happen if Rick decided I'd damaged his relationship with Haley so badly that he couldn't forgive me. Would he leave? Would he resent me forever? I closed the laptop and went to bed but couldn't sleep. Rick was already asleep facing away from me. Rick's sister sent him a text the next morning with screenshots attached. I was feeding the twins breakfast when he showed me his phone. Haley had posted on Facebook about being abandoned by her father, who chose his new perfect family over her. The post had 60 comments and they were all sympathetic. People were calling Rick a deadbeat dad and me a manipulative stepmother. Some distant cousins I'd never met were saying they always knew Rick would do this. One of Haley's friends commented that stepmothers always steal fathers from their real children. I felt sick reading them. I wanted to comment the truth about what she'd said, but Rick grabbed his phone back. He said posting anything would make it worse. I asked how it could get worse than everyone thinking I was evil. He said trust him, it could get a lot worse. The twins were watching us argue and Nova started crying. I picked him up and took both boys to the playroom while Rick stared at his phone looking defeated. That evening, Rick was quieter than usual during dinner. After we put the twins to bed, he said he needed to talk to me. We sat in the living room and he admitted he'd been talking to Julia about ways to help Haley without telling me. I felt like he'd punched me in the stomach. I asked how long he'd been doing that and he said since the registration got blocked. I stood up and said he was undermining me and making me look like the only bad guy. He said he was her father and couldn't just abandon her. I yelled that he'd abandoned me by going behind my back to his ex-wife. He said I'd made a unilateral decision, so he was making one too. I said that wasn't the same thing at all and he knew it. He got up and grabbed a pillow from the couch. I asked what he was doing and he said he was sleeping in the guest room. I followed him down the hall asking if he was serious. He closed the guest room door without answering. I stood there for 5 minutes before going back to our bedroom. I lay awake until 4 in the morning thinking about how I might have destroyed my marriage over one horrible dinner. Nova woke up screaming at 2 in the morning 3 nights later. I ran to his room and found him crying about Sissy being mad at him. I held him and said Sissy wasn't mad, but he kept asking when she was coming home because he missed her. It took an hour to get him back to sleep. The next morning, Ember wouldn't let me leave the bathroom while I showered. He stood outside the glass door crying until I got out. At breakfast, he sat in my lap instead of his high chair and wouldn't eat unless I fed him. This went on for a week. I took them to their pediatrician for their regular checkup and mentioned the changes. The doctor asked if there was stress at home. I admitted things were tense with Rick and his daughter. She said gently that kids pick up on household stress and it affects their behavior. She suggested family therapy. I left feeling worse than when I came in. I'd cut Haley off to protect the twins from her cruelty, but now my decision was hurting them differently. A week later, a thick envelope arrived addressed to Rick from a law office in Julia's state. He opened it at the kitchen table while I made the twins lunch. His face went white as he read. He handed me the letter without saying anything. It was from Julia's lawyer demanding we resume tuition payments immediately. The letter threatened a lawsuit for breach of verbal contract and emotional damages to Haley. It claimed Haley's grades were suffering and she was experiencing depression because of our sudden abandonment. There were medical records attached showing she'd been prescribed antidepressants. Rick looked completely defeated. I sat down and read the whole thing twice. I said we never signed anything, so how could they sue us? Rick said verbal contracts can be binding in some states, and Julia probably had emails or texts where we'd discussed paying tuition. I asked how much a lawyer would cost to fight this. He said probably $10,000 just to start. I realized we were going to lose money either way. We couldn't afford tuition, but we also couldn't afford lawyers. I put my head in my hands, and Rick just sat there staring at the letter. Trish from work called me that weekend. She said her daughter went to the same college as Haley and she'd done some digging. I asked what she meant, and Trish said she'd had her daughter check Haley's social media. She sent me screenshots of Instagram stories from the past 2 months. There was Haley at the beach with friends, Haley at a concert, Haley at someone's lake house, Haley at a party with red cups everywhere. None of these were the activities of a depressed girl struggling with abandonment. I felt vindicated seeing proof that Haley was lying to her mother and the lawyer. But I also felt sad. This girl who used to bake with me on Sundays was lying to everyone, including Julia. I thanked Trish and saved the screenshots. Rick was at the grocery store with the twins, so I texted him that I had information about Haley. He didn't respond for 3 hours. Ken called my cell phone on Monday morning. Rick's dad and I had always gotten along fine, but we didn't talk much without Rick around. He asked if I could meet him for coffee without Rick knowing. I was suspicious, but agreed. We met at a diner near his house. Ken ordered coffee and got straight to the point. He said he needed to tell me about Rick's first marriage. I said I knew the basics, but Ken shook his head. He explained that Julia had always used Haley as a weapon. Whenever Rick didn't do exactly what Julia wanted, she'd threaten to withhold custody. She'd cancel his weekends with Haley or suddenly decide Haley needed to stay with her for holidays. Rick would panic and give Julia whatever she demanded just to see his daughter. Ken said this went on for years until Haley turned 12 and could decide for herself. He looked at me seriously and said I wasn't wrong to set boundaries, but I needed to understand Rick was terrified of losing his daughter completely because Julia had already done it before. I felt my chest get tight. I asked if he thought I should just let Julia win. Ken said no, but maybe there was a middle ground that didn't involve lawyers or completely cutting Haley off. I drove home thinking about everything Ken had said and wondering if there was any way to fix this mess I'd created. Ken leaned back in the diner booth and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked older than usual, tired in a way that went deeper than just missing sleep. He said his brother Ashton had been through something similar with his stepkids about 10 years ago. The kids from his wife's first marriage never accepted him and made life miserable whenever they visited. They'd break things in his house and blame him, steal money from his wallet, tell their mom he was mean to them when he'd barely said 2 words. Ashton tried everything to make it work because he loved his wife. He paid for their sports teams and school trips, drove them to practices, showed up for games where they pretended he didn't exist. His wife kept saying they'd come around eventually, but they never did. By the time they were teenagers, they were openly hostile, calling him names and telling him he wasn't their father so he couldn't tell them what to do. The breaking point came when the oldest daughter accused Ashton of hitting her during an argument about her curfew. It wasn't true, but Child Protective Services got involved and investigated him for 3 months. His marriage barely survived, and even after the case was closed, his relationship with those kids were destroyed forever. Ken said Ashton still paid their college tuition because his wife begged him to, but he doesn't speak to them anymore and they don't come to family holidays. He looked at me seriously and said that in blended families, the biological parent always feels torn between their old family and new one. They carry guilt about the divorce, about their kid losing the intact family, about choosing a new partner. The step-parent always feels like the outsider no matter how hard they try because there's this whole history they weren't part of. Kids sense that tension, and sometimes they use it as a weapon, because they're angry about things that aren't really anyone's fault. He said what happened at Rick's birthday dinner was cruel, and I had every right to be hurt. But Haley's been dealing with her parents' divorce since she was 7, and watching her dad build a new family probably brought up feelings she didn't know how to handle. I sat there stirring my coffee and feeling something shift in my chest. This wasn't just about one dinner or one horrible comment. This was years of complicated family stuff that existed before I even met Rick. Haley had been the center of his world after the divorce, and then I showed up, and eventually there were 2 babies who needed constant attention. I'd been so focused on protecting my boys that I hadn't really thought about what it felt like for her to watch her place in her dad's life get smaller and smaller. Ken paid for both our coffees and hugged me before I left. He said Rick loved me and the twins, but he also loved Haley, and somehow we all had to figure out how to exist in the same family without destroying each other. I got home to find Rick giving the twins lunch in their high chairs. He looked at me and asked where I'd been. I told him I'd met with his dad, and he froze with a spoonful of mashed carrots halfway to Nova's mouth. He asked what his dad wanted, and I said just to talk about Haley and the whole situation. Rick put down the spoon and wiped his hands on a towel. He said his dad had no business getting involved, and I shouldn't have gone behind his back. I felt anger flash through me because I'd gone to get coffee with his father, not planned some conspiracy. We didn't talk for the rest of the day. That night after the twins were asleep, I checked Facebook for the first time in a week. My notifications were exploding. Haley had posted a long essay about growing up with divorced parents and feeling replaced by her dad's new perfect family. She'd tagged Rick and actually used the twins' names. The post had been up for 6 hours and already had over 300 comments. I scrolled through them, feeling sicker with each one. Person after person calling Rick a deadbeat dad who abandoned his first daughter for his new kids. Someone said I was clearly a manipulative stepmother who wanted Haley out of the picture. One of Haley's aunts from Julia's side commented about how sad it was that Rick was forgotten where he came from. Extended family members I'd met maybe twice were weighing in with their opinions about our private family business. There were even people I didn't know, friends of friends, adding their thoughts about what terrible parents we were. My hands shook as I read Haley's words about feeling erased and forgotten, about coming home to find her childhood room turned into a playroom for the replacement children, about her dad choosing his new wife over his own daughter. She made it sound like we'd thrown her out on the street. She made it sound like the twins were my idea, and Rick had just gone along with it. She made it sound like I'd systematically pushed her out of her own family. Part of me wanted to write a comment explaining what she'd actually said about my babies. Part of me wanted to post screenshots of her partying at the beach while claiming to be depressed. Part of me just wanted to disappear and never show my face anywhere again. Rick came into the bedroom and saw me staring at my phone. He asked what was wrong, and I turned the screen toward him. His face went white as he started reading. He sat down on the edge of the bed and scrolled through the comments. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he asked if I'd commented or responded, and I shook my head. He said, "Good, don't engage. It'll only make it worse." I asked how it could possibly get worse than hundreds of people thinking we're monsters. He didn't have an answer. The next morning, Rick suggested marriage counseling. He said we clearly couldn't figure this out on our own, and maybe a professional could help us communicate better. I agreed because I didn't know what else to do. We got an appointment for that Thursday with a therapist named Dr. Smith, who specialized in blended families. I went in expecting her to understand my side, to validate how hurt I was by what Haley said, to agree that cutting off tuition was a reasonable consequence. Instead, she spent the whole hour asking me questions that made me defensive. She wanted to know why I'd made such a big financial decision without talking to Rick first. She asked if I'd considered how Haley would feel getting blindsided by her registration being blocked. She pointed out that I'd gone around Rick entirely by calling Julia directly. I tried explaining that I was protecting my children from someone who'd called them spawn. Dr. Smith nodded and said she understood that was hurtful, but then she asked if I'd talked to Haley about why she said it or just immediately retaliated. I said retaliated was a strong word, and she raised her eyebrows. She said I'd taken away $32,000 in financial support as punishment for words said during an argument. I felt my face get hot. I told her she didn't understand what it was like to hear someone say they wished your babies were never born. Dr. Smith said she was sure that was incredibly painful, but then she said something that made me want to walk out. She said it seemed like I was parenting Rick by punishing Haley instead of communicating with my husband about how to handle the situation together. She said Rick was Haley's father and I'd taken away his ability to make decisions about his own daughter. Rick sat very still next to me on the couch. Dr. Smith asked how he felt about my decision, and he said he understood why I was hurt, but wished I'd talked to him first. She asked if we'd discussed our finances together before I made the change, and Rick said no. She asked if we'd agreed on consequences for Haley together, and Rick said no. I felt ganged up on and betrayed. I stood up and said I didn't think this was helping. Dr. Smith asked me to sit back down, but I grabbed my purse and walked out. Rick followed me to the parking lot, asking me to come back inside, but I got in the car. We drove home in silence. We didn't book a second session. That weekend, while Rick took the twins to the park, I sat at the kitchen table with our bank statements spread out in front of me. I went through 6 months of charges line by line. The organic baby food I insisted on buying cost almost twice as much as regular. The designer baby clothes I'd gotten from that boutique downtown added up to over $800 in 3 months. The special educational toys I'd ordered online because I'd read they were better for development. The matching Halloween costumes I'd bought in August because they might sell out. I added it up and felt sick. I'd spent over $3,000 on the twins in just the past few months on things we didn't really need. Meanwhile, I'd been silently resenting every tuition payment that came out of our account for Haley. I thought about all the times I'd seen a charge for her housing or meal plan and felt annoyed that we were supporting her. I remembered feeling bitter when Rick mentioned needing to send her extra money for textbooks. I told myself it was because she was ungrateful and didn't appreciate what we were doing. But sitting there looking at the proof of my own spending, I had to admit something ugly. Part of my anger at Haley came from jealousy about the money Rick had spent on her over the years. Money that went to her instead of going to me and the twins. Money that reminded me she'd been Rick's first family and we were the second one. I felt terrible about myself for even thinking that way. Haley was a kid when I married Rick. She didn't choose for her parents to get divorced. She didn't ask to have her dad remarry and have more children. But somewhere along the way, I'd started seeing her as competition instead of as Rick's daughter who needed support. I closed all the bank statements and put my head down on the table. The twins were my babies and I'd do anything to protect them. But maybe what I'd done wasn't really about protecting them at all. Rick's phone rang Tuesday afternoon while he was working from home. I heard him answer, and then his voice got quiet and serious. He came into the living room where I was building blocks with the twins, and his face looked strange. He said that was the financial aid counselor from Haley's college. Haley was on academic probation, and might lose her merit scholarship entirely if she didn't turn things around next semester. She'd failed 2 classes last term and was barely passing her current ones. The counselor had called because they were concerned about her and wanted to make sure her parents knew what was happening. Rick sat down on the couch and just stared at the wall. I asked what he wanted to do, and he said he didn't know. Nova brought him a block, and Rick took it, but didn't do anything with it. I felt this complicated mix of emotions I couldn't sort out. Part of me was genuinely concerned about Haley's future, because failing out of college would hurt her for years. Part of me was angry that she was wasting the opportunities she had while playing victim on Facebook. Part of me felt guilty wondering if the tuition situation had made her grades worse. Part of me thought she'd been partying too much based on those Instagram photos, and this was her own fault. I realized I still cared about her despite everything that had happened. That confused me because I wanted to just write her off as cruel and selfish, but I couldn't. She'd been part of our family for years. She'd helped paint the nursery and held the twins when they were newborns. She'd called me her bonus mom and baked cookies with me on Sunday afternoons. That girl still existed somewhere under all the anger and hurt. Thursday night, Rick told me he was going to visit Haley at college this weekend to talk things through. I asked if I was invited, and he said no. This needed to be just them. I felt like he'd punched me in the stomach. I asked if he was choosing her side after everything she'd said and done. He said this wasn't about sides. It was about being her father and trying to fix things before she completely destroyed her future. I said I was his wife and we should make decisions together. He looked at me and said I'd made a unilateral decision about her tuition, so he was making a unilateral decision about going to see her. I felt tears start and tried to hold them back. We had a huge argument where I accused him of betraying me, and he accused me of trying to cut his daughter out of his life. He said I'd put him in an impossible position where he had to choose between his wife and his child. I said he was being dramatic, and he said I was being controlling. We both said things we probably shouldn't have. He slept in the guest room again. Friday morning, he packed a bag and left for Haley's college without saying goodbye. I stood in the kitchen watching him drive away, and wondered if our marriage was actually going to end over this. I spent the weekend working through everything with Rick while the twins stayed with my mom. We sat at the kitchen table with our bank statements spread out, the tuition numbers from community college written on a notepad, and we actually talked through what we could manage without destroying ourselves financially. Rick admitted he'd been terrified of Haley ending up like his cousin who never finished school and worked retail for 20 years, which was why he'd been throwing money at the problem instead of addressing her behavior. I told him I'd been so focused on protecting the twins that I'd forgotten Haley was still just a kid who'd watched her family split apart and didn't know how to handle it. We agreed to cover 1 semester at the community college near Julia's house, around $8,000 instead of $32,000, with clear conditions attached. Haley had to maintain a B average, attend family therapy sessions twice a month either in person or video, and no more social media posts trashing us. If she kept her grades up and actually worked on things, we'd help her transfer to a state school for her junior year. It wasn't the dream college she'd wanted, but it was something, and it felt more honest than just handing over money while she called my kids spawn on the internet. Rick drove to Julia's house to tell Haley in person while I stayed home with the boys. He came back 3 hours later looking exhausted but relieved, said Haley cried and admitted she'd been failing because she was depressed and angry, but didn't know how to ask for help. She agreed to the community college plan and said she'd try therapy if it meant not losing her dad completely. I felt this weird mix of hope and caution because I wanted to believe she was being genuine, but I'd also seen her manipulate situations before. 2 weeks later, we got the confirmation that Haley was enrolled for spring semester at the community college, living with Julia, and her first therapy appointment was scheduled. Rick seemed lighter, like he'd been carrying concrete blocks and finally put them down. Thanksgiving came faster than I expected, and suddenly Haley was driving up with Julia for dinner. I spent the morning cooking and trying not to throw up from nerves while the twins ran around asking when Sissy was coming. Rick kept checking his phone and rearranging things on the table that didn't need rearranging. When they arrived, Haley looked different, thinner and tired with her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, instead of the perfect curls she usually had. The twins screamed and ran to her, and she actually got down on the floor and let them climb on her instead of pushing them away. Julia stayed for an hour making awkward small talk before leaving, and then it was just us. Dinner was quiet at first, everyone careful with their words, but Ember knocked over his milk and we all laughed and it broke some of the tension. After the twins went to bed, Haley asked if we could talk privately. My stomach dropped, but I followed her to the back porch where we used to sit and braid hair years ago. She looked at her hands and said she was sorry for calling the twins Spawn, that she'd been so angry about feeling replaced that she'd said the cruelest thing she could think of. She said her therapist was helping her understand that her feelings about the divorce and the new family were valid, but the way she'd expressed them was wrong. I told her I was sorry for cutting off her tuition without warning, that I should have talked to Rick first and handled my hurt feelings better, instead of making a huge decision out of anger. We both cried a little, and it wasn't perfect or completely healed, but it was something real. She went inside and played blocks with the twins before bed, and Nova fell asleep holding her hand. 3 months passed, and Haley called every Sunday to video chat with the twins. She'd hold up drawings she made in her art class, silly pictures of dinosaurs and trucks that made the boys laugh and point at the screen. Her grades came in at the end of the semester showing 3 Bs and an A-, and Rick cried when he saw them. She still made comments sometimes about feeling left out when we posted family photos, still had moments where you could tell she was struggling with everything, but she was actually trying instead of just being angry. I had to accept that our relationship would never be what it was when she was 12 and we baked cookies together on Sundays. She wasn't my bonus daughter anymore in that simple way, and the twins had changed everything whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. But she was working on things, and that mattered. Rick and I went to therapy ourselves and worked through how we'd both handled everything badly, him avoiding conflict and me making big decisions alone when I felt hurt. We had hard conversations about communication and priorities, about how we'd almost lost our marriage over not talking to each other. The twins asked about Sissy constantly, and lit up every time she video called, and when she came home for spring break, they followed her around the house like puppies. Things weren't perfect and probably never would be, but we were figuring out how to actually be a blended family, instead of pretending everything was fine while resentment built up underneath. I'd learned that protecting my kids sometimes meant having uncomfortable conversations instead of dramatic gestures, and that Haley was allowed to have complicated feelings about her family changing, even if the way she'd expressed them was completely wrong.